Right, hi guys. Um, Thank you for joining me on this video once again. I must apologize to everybody who was in that session where I thought it was Monday. I'm such a nana. I'm really sorry about that. But it's actually maybe not a bad thing because now we can have this video recording, and because it is a little bit of a complicated topic, it's sometimes actually quite nice to go back and listen again or press pause or like pause and then send me a Slack message and be like, what are you talking about? So maybe this is going to work once again a little bit better. So just a little bit of background as well about the last minute change in the structure we were going to do. I think where I am not, and rather we then started doing the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, because I think that understanding these three registers that Lacan is speaking about makes it easier to understand what the hell he means when he says the unconscious is structured like a language. So hopefully that's going to be a little bit. This is going to be a little bit helpful. So in the class, I actually drew this on the board, but I think that this one works a little bit better. So going through this, I just want you guys to take a photo on your phone quickly of this, like while I'm explaining it to you, so that whilst I'm talking, you can refer back. So like I said, Lacan wants us to think of the unconscious as being something structured like a language, which we're going to cover more on Wednesday, but he specifically wants us to think in terms of semiotics. So he's not suggesting that the unconscious is structured like a language, saying that it's like German or French or whatever it may be, but that the same kinds of rules apply that we use in order to use language. He says that that's the same thing that happens on an unconscious level for us. So he doesn't believe that the unconscious is something, well, it's obviously pre-linguistic, but it's not pre-symbolic in this kind of way. There are structures and stuff that we kind of psychically almost plug into in order to understand what's going on in the world. But we'll get to that. So the point is that he's suggesting that these rules of language apply in terms of like a chain of signification in a sense. So a word on its own doesn't necessarily have any meaning, just as a symbol on its own doesn't necessarily have any meaning. But that it depends on the same kinds of rules that we have in language in order to understand, that we need for understanding to develop. So this is, you guys remember the sign, the signifier, and the signified, hopefully. But just a quick recap, the signifier, this is the sign's physical form, the picture, the word, or the sound, something distinct from its meaning. So again, like a picture of an apple. And the signified, these are both de Saussure, by the way, the meaning or the idea expressed by the sign. So something distinct from its physical form. So if using the example of the apple that I used last week, the idea expressed here would be whatever idea comes to mind when you say apple, be it health, be it technological products or whatever it may be. It's that concept that idea that's expressed by the form itself. Then in de Saussure's approximation, there is this bar that I'm going to speak about, but this is essentially when these two sort of make meaning. There's a moment that these two mix with each other, the signifier and the signified. They pass over this bar that he says, and that's what becomes the sign. So the signifier and the signified, when they're together, is the thing that creates the sign. So as you'll see, we're going to be talking about the signified, the symbolic, that's Lacan's term, and then the symbol, which is Charles Saunders Peirce. I'm going to give you a quick description of the symbol and the icon in a second. But just remember that these things work together and refer back to it on your phone when we get to that point. And this is the Peirce's icon, index, and symbol, so that you see the symbol, the icon, and then the index. Here, the icon is the physical resemblance of a thing to what's being represented. So like a little dude on a bike, you don't need any language, you know what that is, you can see what it is. It's not something culturally specific, but everybody can kind of understand what that is. Obviously, if you've grown up in a forest and you've never seen a bike in your life, it's not going to make sense, but we are talking about the average person living in civilization here. Index is that thing that gives an evidence of something that's happening. So smoke, sort of indicates that there's some sort of fire happening somewhere. And then the symbol, something that bears no resemblance between the signifier and the signified. And these are usually things that are culturally specific. So the easiest way to think about it is the numbers 1, 2, and 3, A, B, C. So if you speak Cantonese, 1, 2, and 3, the Arabic numerals aren't going to mean anything to you, or, sort of the A, B's, and C's won't mean anything to you because it is something specific to a particular kind of language. I hope that makes sense. It's something that's culturally specific, and it's something that you need to be taught. Okay, so just also take a photo of that if you haven't done so yet. I'll wait. All right, so in this video, we're going to discuss Lacan's orders of the psyche, these registers of what he calls the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Simply put, these are like registers of thought or language, as Lacan would want us to think, but registers of thought through which we perceive things in the world, right? So something both external and internally. There are these ways in which, these processes and these things that we undergo in order to develop what we think about ourselves, these processes. This is how we become a subject, by moving through these different registers. So just going back very briefly, Freud more spoke about the unconscious, or the preconscious, unconscious, and the conscious. Then he spoke about the ego and the superego. And I think by now that we can all sort of understand and agree that Freud's conception of these things within the human mind is something interior. So he was speaking very specifically about an interior development of subjectivity, right? But for Lacan, the subject, this overall thing is something that's far more abstract, right? It's something that exists like out there, right? Like a force field within a universal kind of matrix in a sense. And it's constituted through external processes like language, like law. Remember we watched that video and they spoke about the big other, the culture that exists outside, right? This is also something Lacan kind of calls the law of the father. But he wants us to think of our development of subjectivity as something not necessarily exclusively external, because he was also still building on Freud, but something he wants us to focus on the external that affects our development as subjects. So this is where he speaks about the imaginary and the symbolic and the real. So now I don't want you guys to try and correlate these things too much, the imaginary with this with this with this. Don't try and do that, because they're not exactly, they don't correlate exactly. They don't completely correspond. So you may end up confusing yourself. So just don't think about it like that. The real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, they don't represent a model of the psyche, like Freud's would have done. But like I say, rather this system of interacting realms or orders or registers in which the psyche functions, and the realms in which we come to constitute ourselves as subjects. So where Freud's model deals with the psyche as an interiority, all those contained components. This is where that I think I mentioned about ego psychology. So ego psychology in England and in America focused very much on the development of the self, the ego being the root of potential psychological problems. And it was Lacan that really hated this egocentric ego philosophy, thinking of the ego as the center of the subject. He, like I say, is far more abstract, thinking about this universal matrix that influences our development of our subjectivity and our self, subjectivity with a little s. So the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic are properties of this matrix. And they kind of provide a framework for us understanding how the mind functions. Again, particularly from an exterior kind of realm. So he imagines this, sorry, the cursor's in the way. He imagines this as this threefold Borromean knot, the Borromean family crest. It's an Italian family that this crest of theirs represents strength and unity. The point is that if one of these rings are removed from this particular knot, then the whole thing will fall apart. And this analogy also becomes important when we're going to speak on Wednesday about chains of signification, and how if one chain is broken within the signification, then it all falls apart. But yeah, so Lacan wants us to realize firstly that it's impossible to disengage or to extricate any sort of phenomenon that happens to us, be it language, be it whatever we encounter in life, phenomenon. And we can never extricate those phenomena from any of these three realms. So it is that makes it also really tricky to speak about this in just sort of like a 50-minute lecture. So I'll be repeating myself quite a bit, but please just bear with me. The second thing he wants us to realize is not only that we can't remove any phenomenon from this, but that none of these realms sort of function independently either. In his conception, all of the psychological activity happens in the spaces between, and I'm now pointing at this thing and I just realized you can't see me, in the spaces between between these realms, and the advent of a psychotic break or a sort of psychosis or a neurosis or whatever it may be is the unraveling of this knot. Again, these three categories are heavily linked to semiotics, so please just keep that photo that you just took handy. So the imaginary. So now I just want you to try and let this term wash over you for now. It's not imaginary insofar as it's something that's unreal. Obviously, that plays into it a little bit. But as with all of the psychoanalytical language, we need to try and remove our antecedent understanding, our sort of like pre-existing understanding of words, because people like Lacan were using them in such different ways. So just let this term wash over you for now. All right. So the imaginary is the realm of the senses. Right? It evolves from the sensory experiences that we have within the world. So literally our sense of touch, smell, sight, space, time, and so on, all of those kinds of things. Right? It's the realm of the senses. It develops, according to Lacan, from the mirror phase. So when the baby experiences the body is fragmented, blah, blah, blah. Again, you guys look at yourselves right now. You're not constantly thinking about yourself as a whole. It's kind of like a first-person shooter game where you're just arms and a gun and feet. You being a baby is kind of like that. So this is the realm of the imaginary and something that is in the mirror phase. So of all of the senses that we have as infants, and again, I'm not like, I just need to stress this, I'm not being ableist, I'm just drawing of Lacan here. Baby's born with sight. So of all of the senses, the sight is the best developed within the baby. You have not learnt language yet. So you can't really make sense of what it is that you're seeing, but you're still seeing something. And this forms a lot of the early information gathering that happens within the child. So, for example, the sight of the mother or the sight of the self in the mirror. This is something that's still before language. It becomes before that development of language, but it is the sort of first signifying process that we have. So the images or the signifieds, if you go back to your image, the signifieds, that meaning or the idea that is expressed by the sign is something that belongs to the imaginary. So again, the image of the mother and the image of the self are experienced as the lowercase kind of r real. They don't read as an image pointing towards a concept because there's no true concept yet. In other words, we don't know the word mother, so it's just an image of a face. And we also don't have the concept of face yet, but it's just that thing that's in front of us. When we develop language, we obviously start decoding these things, but just remove all of those from your mind for a second. It's just this thing that you see in front of you. There is no true concept, and it's read just as an image pointing towards some other concept. So the image of the mother and, of course, the image of the self in the mirror are what Lacan would have said are sort of like proto-representations, right? So proto meaning primitive. Representations that are not yet linked to language. And we form these proto-concepts within the realm of the imaginary, within the realm of the visible, or the visual anyway. So when the baby sees itself in the mirror, it builds this proto-concept that is the ideal I sort of image. And it's a very powerful moment because this is essentially an illusion. You get these ideas of what you're supposed to be, a very surface level thing, but it is something very powerful, something that is an ideal image of yourself. I hope that makes sense. So the mirror stage then, for Lacan, is the entry into the imaginary. And this is important because it creates, again, that foundation for the sense of the self. It's imaginary, well, it's within the imaginary, rather, that one sees the similarities and the differences between oneself and the other. And becomes, this is where you develop either a compulsion or a attraction to certain things. So I'm going to send you guys to a link to a little video where the guy uses like Peter Pan to describe it. But essentially, Lacan called the imaginary order something narcissistic, but also something speculative. So speculative, think about how when kids are playing, they make up these wildly inaccurate stories about how things work, like things can fly or mermaids exist or whatever, right? That's the kind of speculative realm that kids use during play, but narcissistic in terms of like they believe that they're the center of the universe. Because whenever you ask, if you're a child and you ask your parents, I want this, they'll give it to you immediately, because you're a child and you want whatever it is that you want, unless your parents are horrible, in which case, I'm sorry. But yeah, so anyway, there's something it's like dangerous about this imaginary if it's left untamed. So again, it's something that exists in a sense in the Freudian id, in a sense, and sort of leaving the imaginary untamed without the external forces of the superego or the societal rules or whatever. We need to learn these rules in order to function, because we can't think that we exist as just these sort of things outside of the law. Again, some people do think they do, but you get the idea. So then lastly, the imaginary was also linked to Peirce's icon. Right? So remember the little icon of the bicycle. It's something that's understood quite easily without any sort of mediation. And it's linked to de Saussure's signified, the concept which is sort of then arbitrarily represented by the sign. So yeah, this is why he's now using semiotics. You see, he's trying to speak about it in terms of a pre-linguistic stage. This is why semiotics for him was so interesting. Some argue that he fundamentally misunderstood semiotics and semiology, sort of by the Ferdinand de Saussures and the Charles Saunders Peirce, but I think it's really useful to think about it in terms like this. So this is another article that also quite nicely explains these different registers, but it's following the mirror phase that this internalized image of the ideal whole self sort of comes to the fore. This notion of coherence rather than fragmentation, right? So it's where the ego is actually sort of what did I say there? Well, not I. The space in which the relation between the ego and its images is developed. So this is where you start understanding, the development between, or the correlation between the different registers and the different images in terms of your formation of the ego. So I hope that makes sense. So that then brings us to the concept of the symbolic. This is perhaps the easiest to understand because the word makes sense and it's closest to its common meaning that you guys are coming to this class with. The symbolic order for Lacan is essentially where the law steps in. Right? The symbolic is something that is made manifest in laws, convention, language, social structures, etc., etc. It's where all of these things take meaning. So the symbolic then pre-exists, in a sense, like language. So we don't inherently have language. We need to be taught it in order to gain access to it. And language, like Lacan wants us to think, works like the unconscious. It's made up of only signifiers. So just go back to your little thing, that physical sign. The symbolic is made up of signifiers and not the signified, right? Symbolic is made up of signifiers, not signified. Okay, the signified is the one that is in the imaginary. Just giving you guys a second to think about that. Okay. Right. So as explained in that the sort of like previous slide, for the newborn, the first signifier is that maternal signifier, that they see the mother's face, which is the entry, obviously, into the symbolic then. The mother's face is something that constantly disappears and reappears. So like I spoke about last week, the baby only becomes aware of the sort of like presence and absence, becomes aware of this presence and absence, and through doing so is aware when the mother is not there. So by becoming aware of the mother as an entity that can remove herself and is not just part of the environment, there starts to be this chain of signification, right? It's the absence of the mother that makes her apprehensible as an entity. So it's only when she is absent that the infant can make sense of her existence. Otherwise, just like I said to the second class, if you imagine something just being in front of your face your whole life, you don't really think about it as anything. Well, we can't really think like that. But if you had to imagine that you had something in front of your face for your entire life, you would think that that's just how it is. But the moment it's taken away, it's in that moment of absence that meaning starts forming. Because then you realize that it's not just part of, small case R, reality, or the real. It's something that's removed. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm not making sense. But if not, please just send me a Slack message. So it's the symbolic is accessed through this lack, through what is missing. So the symbolic is only accessible when the mother leaves the room and the child screams bloody murder, because there's now something in its lowercase r reality that's disappeared. So access through the lack, through that which is missing, and it's there that we start using language to ask for what is not there, right? Again, for what's lacking or what's absent. We scream for our mothers, or we cry for our mothers, or we ask for whatever it is that we want that's not there. And this idea of absence and lack is really important in understanding the real. So I hope that makes sense. If not, please pause here, send me a Slack message immediately, because I'm going to now continue on to the real in a second. So yeah, the symbolic, this is akin to Peirce's symbol. As I said, the symbol bears no resemblance between the signifier and the signified, something that needs to be learned, culturally specific. So numbers, letters, those kinds of things. But it covers all social structures, again, from language to law. It's the signs and the symbols and the concepts and the rules and all those things that constitute what most of us call, again, lowercase r, reality. So for Lacan, the symbolic carves up the world into language, right? The only way that we can understand things is by carving up all of these different facets, all of these different objects or concepts or whatever it may be into a language. But in doing that, necessarily leaves things out. I'll explain that a little bit more in depth in a second. So yeah, again, from this, the symbolic involves the formation of signifiers and language and is considered to be the determining order of the subject. Manifest in an endless web of signifiers, signified associations. And what that means there is that it's only through interplay between different signs that we can create meaning. So we're going to do this next year. In terms of Jacques Derrida, he speaks about deconstruction, but essentially we can only know what something means by knowing what it doesn't mean. So the example I like using, a cat is only a cat because it's not a pot plant. It's not me. It's not the tarred road outside. It's not my mug of coffee over here. But in the idea or the concept of cat, we know that cat is not Desiree. Cat is not coffee mug. Cat is not Hannah, right? We know that, Hannah. We know that there are traces within the concept of cat of not Hannah, not coffee mug, not pot plant, right? It's a really interesting concept. But that's the idea of this endless chain of signified associations. So again, when we have this concept of cat, we have all of those absent concepts over there, things that have been left out in order to understand a particular thing that's in front of us. The symbolic then functions, as said here, functions in the way that the subject is organized, and it's how the psyche becomes accessible. So again, Lacan would want us to think that the psyche becomes accessible perhaps before that, but the idea is this is where we start using language and start making sense of ourselves. Make sense? I hope so. So then it comes to the concept of the real. So this is a concept that Lacan only developed a little bit later in life, and it is a little bit confusing. I hope that it's going to make sense. On the video, again, please pause and ask me questions if it doesn't make sense, because this is quite crucial. So now also, don't think of the real, in inverted commas, in terms of it being the opposite of something unreal. This should actually be a capital R, but yeah. So don't think of it in terms of like the unreal, but again, there is something a little bit involved in that. Point is, don't overthink the term, okay? So the real, this is the term developed for Lacan because the formation of the imaginary and the symbolic always made it feel as if something was being left out. But this is something far more difficult to describe. For Lacan, the real, the capital R real, is that which is left out, the bit that the signifier fails to capture. Again, for anything to exist for Lacan, he's sort of drawing off that Hegelian dialectic. For anything to exist, there needs to be an antithesis. It's like reverse. So remember we spoke about the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, right? So you have one thing, you contrast it with another thing, and then you come to the third thing in the middle. That's that Hegelian dialectic. So that's essentially what's happening here. For anything to have meaning, there needs to be that which is the inverse. It's antithesis. I can't say that word today. So what the real is then for Lacan is that which cannot be captured by the signifier. He argues that for for everything that comes into our perception through the signifier. So again, through that physical sign, that picture of the apple or whatever it may be. For everything that comes into our perception through a signifier, there must be something imperceptible, something that's unsymbolized. Again, Derrida's trace. There is traces of not Hannah in my cat that's lying here next to me. In every sign, there is a bunch of different signs that are not there. Right? That's the absence there. So Lacan describes this capital R real as a smooth and sort of like undifferentiated clay. It's that featureless clay from which reality is constructed by the symbolic. It's the chaos from the words, from which words are encoded, that thing that's beyond the limits of language. It exists in everything that cannot be pinned down by a signifier. It's essentially like the ingredients to a thing, right? It's like the soup. So I used in the other class the creative process, all right? So if you are given a brief that you need to do this thing, right, you don't know at all what it is that you're going to do. So you use language in order to, now language, not like spoken language necessarily, but language in terms of you're accessing concepts and you're accessing all these different kinds of things that give you ideas on how to complete the brief, right? So you're using language to pluck out of what Lacan would call the real, ideas and concepts. It's this like layer that exists below us. And this becomes really sort of like metaphysical, and we'll get into it a little bit more next year. Deleuze and Guattari speak about it, and they call it the plane of immanence. It's this pre all of us everything from which, that primordial soup from which we sort of like pull ideas and pull concepts. It's very, like I say, very metaphysical. Don't try and bend your brains too much. But the point is that it's that layer of stuff that exists below us that we can only access through the use of language. But by accessing it through the use of language, we are taking it from the real and putting it into the symbolic, into something that is physically identifiable. I hope that makes sense. Through that process of symbolization, through the process of using language or looking at pictures, we are taking from the real and making concrete things in our conception. So the only way that phenomena exist, and again, phenomena could be absolutely anything, the bonsai over there, or a film, or democracy. Any phenomena that exists has only come to exist through this process of symbolization, because we have taken these concepts out of that primordial soup and made them something real. Okay, so all of these things don't just materialize out of nowhere. There is something. And again, it sounds very much like, thinking about a God almost, in a sense, that there is this thing that is beyond comprehension, because our brains are not so good at things. As amazing as our brains are, they're really not good at going this far, at conceiving of these kinds of strange out there things. But even by the process of me trying to describe it, I'm pulling things out of the real, putting it into the symbolic, and thereby making it not real anymore. Essentially, the real is something that is ineffable, right? It's something unimaginable. Perhaps a state that we could only think of as, in utero, pre-birth, before language, before any of that jazz. So Bruce Fink, who did a lot of the translation of Lacan's work, describes the real as that which resists symbolization absolutely. It's the authentic, the unchangeable truth, the infinite, the absolute, something that's not flexible like the symbolic realm is. It's not made up of sort of superficial images of symbols. And again, we only do this because our little brains can't comprehend. We have very serious limitations in terms of what we can comprehend. So the idea is that the real is not something that is made up of these superficial images. The idea is that for Lacan, we mustn't think of the real as something that exists within our own minds. It's something that is far bigger than us, right? It exists outside of us. The real is outside of language. It's outside of logic, and outside of any tools that the human mind has thus far come up with in order to comprehend and understand reality. Now, I know this sounds really wacky, but it actually does make a lot of sense, because where does creativity come from? right? You don't know. There's something, I think creativity is the easiest way to think about this. When you have this genius idea of you're going to create this beautiful thing or this app idea or whatever it may be, that feels like it comes out of nowhere, right? But it's not. This is what Lacan is speaking about in terms of the real. So the real is technically outside of our capacity to think. It's outside of our capacity to like conceive of things. And this is why he refers to it as the realm of the impossible. So this is again akin to, I hope that makes sense. I get really passionate about that bit, so I really hope that makes sense. It's akin to Peirce's concept of the index, right? So the index being that evidence of something that's going on, the smoke versus the fire. And in de Saussure's semiotics or semiology, he speaks about this in terms of the bar, that moment where the signifier and the signified slip between that division between them. And that's where it becomes something that we can perceive and understand, if that makes sense. But we'll speak a little bit more about that next week. So, like I say, the real is sort of like akin to that Deleuzian and Guattarian plane of immanence. Another one is Plato's world of forms. Both of these things we're going to be getting into in the first term of next year. But the plane of immanence is that primordial soup, but Plato calls it the world of forms. He says that there exists somewhere out there in the universe the ideal form of a particular thing. So like this coffee mug. Let's go back to the coffee mug. There, for Plato, would be the ideal form of what a coffee mug should look like. And it's that ideal form toward which all makers of coffee mugs should aspire. Okay, maybe a coffee mug's a bad idea. It's difficult to describe. There's an ideal thing towards which you should... men, right? Sorry, guys. There's the concept of the ideal man exists out there. And it's that ideal man in that world of forms that Plato would call it, that you need to try and mold yourself upon, right? And that's obviously, again, something going to be culturally specific. So don't think about it that way. There's just that ideal. Again, deeply philosophical. Don't try and hurt your brains. But this is essentially a space before language, before we enter into the symbolic, before we start using language to make sense of the chaos in which we find ourselves. Think of a black hole. That's it. Think of a black hole. We know that black holes are there, but we can't see them. We can't fathom them. We're trying to use maths, but the maths is failing. We don't know precisely how or what they are, but we know that they're there. It's kind of like that, in a sense. Yeah. Okay, so then this is a video. Like, I don't think it's going to...
Hello, everyone. I'm John Cornelius, and this is a thought-cooperative presentation of key concepts in psychology.
The video. So I'm not going to try and play it here, but I'll send you guys a link to this. It's very cute because he speaks about it in terms of Peter Pan and, like, what's that other one? Lord of the Flies. So I'll send you guys a link to
Hello,
that.
everyone.
But very broadly, I think that in terms of art, like, it's pretty easy to see this happening. So Loretta is obviously the art fundi. I'm the film girl. So just very broadly in terms of the imaginary, the real, and symbolic, with these sort of like art examples here. The imaginary is, again, the realm of the senses. So representative art contains a great amount of this imaginary, the senses, in terms of the sensuous quality of materials, of draped fabrics, like glittering surfaces. So all of these senses. It's also interesting to think about how sort of like pre-Renaissance, this wasn't really as much at work because artwork was more filled with the symbolic function of art, quite literally. So then the symbolic perhaps comes to, so that's the sort of the examples of the imaginary. The symbolic perhaps comes more to the fore in conceptual art like this, something that has a meaning attached, but it's more about what we can say about those particular items that matters. It's the ideas that they invoke instead of that sensuous, or like, I don't want to say sensual, but the response that we have with our senses, a sensuous response. Whereas the real, like this image is just, you can't really represent the real. So the real is sort of like the drive that you feel, that thing that compels you to keep creating, keep making, keep feeling, something that's never really attained. So you just keep going at it, that primal thing that you're after. So maybe something akin to the id, but it's also that realm in which you that realm you access in order to create things, to create art, to create ideas, app ideas, design ideas, whatever kind of ideas you're coming up with now, or ideas for your for your psychoanalysis projects. Okay, so again, I have a lot more fun talking about this in terms of film, and I think I'm a little bit more articulate in terms of film, but I think I can, if you are more interested in applying this to art, then I can ask Loretta just to have a little quick word with you guys. The use of that sort of triad of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic can be thought of in two ways. So we can think of the filmic object itself, as well as looking at the narrative, within the thing. So I've used this image because I do like talking about Black Swan, because it goes both ways, and it's also a very cool picture of her in the mirror. But so if looking at this as a filmic object, a good use of this triad, again, is seen in the work of Laura Mulvey and her Lacanian use of Lacanian concepts in order to determine like scopophilia and voyeurism, the position of women, blah, blah, blah. But I don't want you to think of just Mulvey, please, because she's not the only psychoanalyst or psychoanalytical film scholar, although she's one of the greats. So thinking again of that triad, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, in terms of the filmic object, the imaginary, so once again, that meaning or the idea expressed by the sign. We know that the images that we're seeing on screen are images that are constructed for us to represent a particular desire. It's akin to a sort of mirror moment, the moment where you look at these images and you start to internalize them and to sort of make meaning, and also then identify with the characters on the screen as a kind of ideal image. But again, something superficial. So think of it in terms of the mirror moment. You're now looking at Natalie Portman and you're thinking, yo, I want to be that hot or whatever. Okay, which is stupid, but you know what I mean. So you see that image on screen, or you look at Thor, and that is your ideal image. So you sort of, in that Lacanian mirror moment, you want to become that ideal person, but it's still something constructed and becoming this internalized desire and blah, blah, blah. I hope that makes sense. The symbolic, let's go this way. The symbolic then, if we think about this particular example of the filmic object, symbolic, again, where I just described the symbolic to you. The imaginary is being the idea expressed by that sign, The symbolic is that sign's physical form. Again, these are if we're looking at it a filmic object, these are the various representations and the codes and the mise en scène, so the costume, the lighting, the props, the actual dialogue between characters. All of those things are something that are symbolic. They are physical things that we're able to see. And it's those codes that structure the film in a particular way. So don't worry too much about thinking about this in terms of a filmic object. I just want to show you that it works in two ways here. And then lastly, the real. Again, this is really super sticky notion, slippery at best, but essentially it's that internal unconscious maneuvering that you as the spectator feel as you interact with the imaginary and the symbolic. It's that weird space that happens while you're watching a film, right? That's kind of the real. And so I hope that makes sense. Watching a film is essentially like a mirror moment as well. And films love using mirrors, so this is another reason I use this particular image. Think about the horror genre. There's that jump scare, sort of when the character closes the mirror and there's somebody in the mirror that you didn't expect. That's kind of that disruption of the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, when that Berenian knot comes apart because the real is no longer, that the real has been disrupted. Lowercase r real. It's that disruption of the imaginary, the lowercase real, the imaginary. So your integrity, your bodily integrity in that like moment when you close the mirror and there's someone else there is disrupted by that person that's sort of exterior to you, and you start questioning the solidity of your own image. That's kind of like, that's sort of the mirror moment, I suppose. And it's also, if we think about the mirror moment as something that we're never going to become that ideal I that we see ourselves in the mirror or that we see in other people. And this is also what happens in films. Like, we're never going to become that ideal, like thing being shown to us. If you do want to become Natalie Portman in Black Swan, then please tell me, because we're going to need to get you fixed because there's something wrong with you. It's a very dark movie if you haven't watched it. The idea is that we see these characters and we try and attain that same kind of thing. If that makes sense. Hope it makes sense. That's not to say that all of us do that, but the process of identification of between us and characters on TV or in film, that's exactly what's happening. We're identifying with these characters. In a psychoanalytical lens, we would think that you would want to become that person, but obviously that's a tenuous assertion at best. So that's the filmic object. But specifically, we're going to look at this in terms of the narrative. So this, I just showed you guys the video of, or the trailer, and I hope at this point you've watched the film because I'm going to ruin it. Nick, please just press pause if you haven't watched it yet, okay? Thank you. Right, so if we think once again of those realms, the imaginary, again, akin to the mirror stage, child recognizes itself in the mirror, becomes the object, an externalization of their ideals, the development of the I, the ego, all of that jazz. But it's not an image that corresponds with that undeveloped infant mind. The child realizes that they are not fragmented, but they are part of a whole, like bodily integrity. But you think that it's something that's never going to be complete, right? Human desires are never going to be satisfied. You're never going to be that ideal image. And that is exactly like the narrator. So this is the narrator. Some people call him Jack. His name is not Jack. His name is the narrator. He doesn't have a name. And this is exactly that mirror moment happening. Not necessarily in this exact still, but this, if we think of the narrator as the infant, he is looking at Tyler as the ideal external I, and he wants to become more like Tyler. He essentially his alter ego. So at that mirror stage, you see something like Tyler as the external. He's the external sort of like throughout the film, and the narrator will never become as great as that ideal Tyler. All right, Tyler is gorgeous. He's ripped. He's articulate. He gets women. He's confident. He's all the things that the narrator wishes that he could be. So in the beginning of the film, we are shown the narrator being very much a yes man. He has all of the right things in his apartment. He goes to work on time. Yes, sir. No, sir. 3 bags full, sir. And lives this very dreary life. And then his apartment blows up. And then first he meets Tyler on the flight back from wherever they're coming from. And then his apartment blows up and then shit starts to unravel. So he meets Tyler, and Tyler is that ideal I, that misrecognition now in a mirror moment kind of phase, that misrecognition of the narrator from himself, that's alienating him from himself. And he comes to adopt the characteristics of Tyler. And Tyler sort of represents the mastery of the self, over the self rather, that the narrator so desperately desires. He embodies this concept of like the signified, right? So the concept towards which the narrator is striving or wants to strive. It's sort of a post-mirror moment stage where the infant, again, understands itself as distinct, as an object. So the narrator recognizes himself as distinct from the object that is Tyler. Of course, at the end of the film, we know that this is not true. We know, spoilers, that Tyler is a figment of the narrator's imagination. It's a part of his psyche. It's a manifestation. It's a psychosis that's happening in the mind of the narrator. Following the apartment being blown up, he starts losing his mind, and it's that Bohemian knot that starts unraveling. And this is where the figure of Tyler comes in. So he's the post-mirror stage kind of ideal, and the narrator starts feeling more and more alienated from himself, adopts the characteristics of the ideal, and hence the psychosis. Hope that makes sense. So that was the imaginary. So now moving on to the symbolic, right? The symbolic, the sign's physical form, the sign, the sound, the word, whatever it may be. The symbolic, the symbol, the signifier. Go look at your picture, right? That thing. So following this mirror moment, right, from the imaginary, following that, child realizes the lack that they have, and in order to take on, in order to be with the mother, needs to adopt the attributes of the father, That's not the mirror moment. That's the Oedipal drama. When the child recognizes, obviously that's post-mirror stage, because you have the mirror stage and then you have the Oedipal drama. If, like Justin wanted us to do, to put it on a linear progression, you would have the mirror phase and then you would have the Oedipal drama. Obviously, they're not necessarily completely distinct and whatever, but sorry, I'm over-explaining that, I think. Post-mirror phase, child has now recognized that they are distinct from their mother, and now starts the Oedipal drama. Oedipal drama where the child wants to be with the mother, but realizes that the father owns, in inverted commas, owns the mother and can take the mother away, right? So therefore the child feels that castration complex and therefore adopts the characteristics of the father in order to possess the mother. This for Lacan would be done through the accessing of that big other, through the language, the law, all of those things that you're faced with that the father possesses. You need to try and access and try and adopt, because you're faced with this lack that you will never be whole or complete. You will never be good enough for your mother in Freudian terms. But for Lacan, there's that missing thing that we need in order to feel complete. So the symbolic register then for Lacan contrasts the imaginary insofar as it involves the formation of the signifier and for the language, right? This becomes the order, the determining order of the individual, and it's how the psyche becomes accessible. So I told you I was going to repeat myself a lot, so I'm sorry. And this idea of lack, again, is an important one. Think about the lack that the narrator feels and how it manifests itself as Tyler. He lacks those qualities that are embodied by Tyler, the good-lookingness, the confidence, the way with women, those kinds of things. All of those qualities that he really wants to adopt, he does in order to be more like Tyler. But perhaps the signifier here, that sign's physical form, can be thought of, interestingly, as the violence, the fighting here. There exists a lack within this group of men, this broader group of men, one of which is Meatloaf and another is Jared Leto. There's Meatloaf over there. I don't know. No, Jared Leto's not in this. Is he back there? I think that might be him. But Jared Leto's in this film, by the way. Anyway, sorry, that was a side note. And there exists within these men a very serious lack, all right? And again, through that Oedipal drama, this is what is missing from these men. And the violence is perhaps a way for them to try and reclaim something that's missing within them. It's perhaps a reflection of the protagonist, I suppose all of them, but their inability to establish an identity for themselves, particularly with the narrator. There is that very serious castration complex between him and Tyler. So he adopts those violent characteristics in order for him to establish an identity for himself. And this is the psychosis, right? It's that unraveling of the Bohemian knot. And also that love triangle. I mean, Tyler becomes somebody that, like I say, signifies the father, but Marla as a character comes to signify perhaps what is the mother. And this is that Oedipal drama at play. So within the dialogue, the narrator at one point says, I don't know my dad. I mean, I know him, but he left when I was like 6 years old, married this woman, had more kids. He did this every 6 years, goes away or goes to a new city and starts a new family. To which Tyler responds, he's setting up franchises. We're a generation of men raised by women. I'm wondering if another woman is what we need. So perhaps in the sense that fighting is that language, how the psyche is something that becomes accessible, that internalized real that cannot be described, exists below them, and it's through the use of violence, right? As like I'm saying, with creative process, you use language and all those kinds of things that come to you to pick out of that primordial soup, pick out of that weird place that we can't really describe in order to create something that fits the brief. This is kind of what's happening here. There's that real that cannot be established, and the language that is perhaps being used is the violence, is the fighting. This failure to establish an identity for himself because there was no male parent is that lack that he's trying to access, right? The lack of the father in the narrator's life. And therefore, like manifesting once again is Tyler. Tyler and Marla, I've got a picture of Marla. Oh, I don't have one here, but Marla is played by Helena Bonham Carter. It's absolutely, she's such a great character. But Marla comes to figure that like maternal figure, but also something strangely paternal at the same time. So if you've watched the film 350,000 times like I have done, you actually see how she adopts the qualities of the father and the mother at different points. But anyway, as a maternal figure, her and Tyler have very strange, very violent sex. And it's Tyler having sex with Marla, that it's through doing that he demonstrates his power over the narrator. The narrator is never going to be the ideal desire for Marla as long as Tyler exists, right? But also the sort of the drama between the signifier, right, the physical form of the sign, and the signified, that meaning or idea. The drama between those two is kind of bridged by Marla. She's a conduit in the sense for the resolution in the fracture between Tyler and the narrator. So we have the narrator as the child, Marla as the mother, and Tyler as the father. Like I say, Tyler and Marla also have this very, very violent, very weird sex, which is perhaps an allusion to the fact that because the master signifier, now Tyler, that ideal parent is something that is missing, he will never be ideal himself. So manifesting as this weirdly violent sex. I hope that sort of makes sense. We're born into the symbolic order, right? And we need to sort of like strive or even fight to attain a place within society and an understanding of society through the process of uncovering the unconscious through language. It's only through uncovering this unconscious, this everything that exists in that unconscious realm, be it in Freudian terms, Lacanian terms, Jungian terms, all of those different things. It's only through accessing that through language that we can actually understand our space in the world. And I mean, isn't that exactly what happens here in this film? It's only through the access of the quite literally the language of violence here, through the use of violence, through the use of fighting. It's only through that he can access a sense of his identity, through looking into his unconscious and pulling out all of these horrible things that make him do these things, that he's able to understand himself and his place in the world. I think it's really interesting. And I've got a whole bunch of other articles that you can read about this because this has been picked to pieces by pretty much everybody on the internet. But in terms of like fragmentation, so again, we spoke in the very first lesson about this idea of the fragment itself. Is the narrator's attempt to find his whole self perhaps reflected in how he describes himself? So again, in the film, he speaks about, I'm Jack's raging bile duct. I am Jack's smirking revenge. I am Jack's inflamed sense of rejection. I am Jack's complete lack of surprise. And of course, this is the reason why people think that his name is Jack, but it's not. Is it not perhaps also an allusion to the regression into the infantile, that he's so in the state of psychosis, the Bohemian knot is coming apart, that he's actually going back to the pre-mirror moment, or trying to go back to the pre-mirror moment, where he is that fragmented infantile kind of thing. He no longer feels whole, right? His apartment's been blown up. He's lost everything. Does he not perhaps wish to return to the state in which, like, where the demands and the needs, sort of repeat once again, and this sensation of the imaginary wholeness perhaps comes to the fore again? That we briefly mentioned the death drive. Is this not perhaps an example of the death drive? This drive towards complete destruction, to go back to what it was that you were before. I don't know. Can you tell I'm really passionate about this film? I like talking about it in terms of Marxism as well. It's also a lot of fun. So the real, again, that really confusing thing, the experience or the thought that occurs that creates a response so like sudden or inexplicable that language doesn't necessarily have the time or the nuance or the sufficiency to sufficiently explain what it is that we're experiencing. That's something primal. So the real is probably like I said, most closely achieved when we're in utero, where there are only needs, there are no desires, no language. We just sort of exist floating in the warm goo of our mother's tummies. We lose something when we enter into the world, and that's kind of like the entry into the symbolic when we're born, in a sense. We lose that sense of wholeness when we enter into language. And that loss of the wholeness is, again, something that we lack and we try and go back to with this compulsive kind of desire. Again, we're only subjects because we're constituted through language, through that symbolic order, and we cannot know what we are sort of without it. But we're not consciously aware of what it is that we actually are. And the real is sort of we're made aware of the real when, sort of the materiality of our existence is sort of disrupted, a kind of trauma that is the result of the threat to our lowercase r reality. So I use the example of natural disasters. So like if a tsunami hits, there's a moment where there's no language that can describe what's happening. And afterwards, language still also fails to adequately describe the horror of what's happening. And that horror, that indescribable thing, is also part of the Lacanian real. But again, our very attempt to describe the horror is how we deal with that lack. Our use of language, we use language to try and deal with that lack, to make it symbolic in order for our little brains to understand it. The disruption of this kind of reality within Fight Club begins pretty early on. This is at the very beginning of the film, and it's only on for like a split second. And it's after this that traditional kind of do not distribute this warning comes up. So I think by now you guys have probably read this. But it's this thing that happens in your brain that happens so quickly that you don't really realize that it happened. It's only because, watching it on a laptop, you can press pause or whatever it is, that you're able to go back and see what it is that happened and then put into language what just happened. This split second is a disruption of the real. And then you go back and try and put into words to try and understand what happened. Again, if you've watched the film 375,000 times, you will know that there are instances where Tyler as a character actually flashes on screen like this. So you'll see that like he's a bit see-through here. It's really difficult to capture this image because it's on for such a fleeting second. And this is another instance of the disruption of the real. It's something that we can't really access. It's at the limits of symbolic order. So again, if you're watching this in the cinema, you can't press pause and go back, but you probably have this moment where you're like, I just saw something, right? And it's that's the limits of the symbolic order. Something happening by accident that we can't use language to really describe what happened, to take it out of the real. And also, interestingly, he's on screen like 4 times before we actually meet him. He's in an advert, and he also flashes on screen like this, which is quite a lot of fun. And him as a character himself, he works as a projectionist, and what he does, it's quite it's funny, but it's a little bit dark. In the narrative, what Tyler does is, as a projectionist in the cinema, he takes movie reels and he splices in split seconds of pornographic images into children's cartoons. But that's also a funny meta joke where Fincher is telling you that he's doing the same thing to you, but you don't even realize it. It's lots of fun. Anyway, so back to the real. The real is that thing then from which everything else comes, that pre-linguistic space. We're made aware of it through the material existence being challenged by disruptions like this. The interruption of these images make us question what's happening in reality with a little r. And the real, capital R, is being pulled out and put into language. It's weird. We catch it, we rewind it, we check it. It's that moment of not understanding. That's the real. When the real is then recognized within the narrative by the narrator, it's that moment where he realizes that he is Tyler. So when the real becomes symbolic, it's taken from the real into the symbolic in these Lacanian terms, then he realizes that he is Tyler and he kills Tyler and therefore becomes his most authentic self. So that's what these psychoanalysts are on about, is accessing your most authentic self. And it's in that moment that he becomes himself. I hope that makes sense. Fun fact, Marla and Tyler are in fact the same person. You'll see in these 2 images, most of the time they wear corresponding outfits. They say similar things. You never see them They don't have reflections. You don't see them in rooms together. They're actually the same person. Also, the spaces in which the narrator is moving don't really exist. Paper Street, the house in which he lives, doesn't exist. The narrator says, when he calls Tyler on the phone, he says, I need to get myself a hotel room, and you actually watch him go and get a hotel room. Paper Street is a figment of his imagination. They say that Marla lives in an apartment, but she doesn't. She lives in a hotel. There's two separate instances where you can see that she's living in a hotel with the names outside the hotel. And again, fun fact, there are two different names for the same hotel in which she lives. The Hotel Lindy, I think it is, and the Bristol Hotel. Right? So we know that Marla is living in a hotel, and we know the narrator is living in a hotel. All right? Paper Street behaves like a hotel. There's always a lot of people there. They're moving in and out. So that's kind of what Fincher is telling us, is that the narrator may very well just be sitting in a chair having an episode. Like this whole thing could be just a psychosis. The Paper Street house also perhaps is a metaphor for his like broken psyche, because we watch him unravel when Marla moves into the Paper Street house, and the personalities that he has, Marla and Tyler, start to lose their compartmentalization, and this is where things start falling apart. Also, interestingly, the narrator has to go off and save Marla from her attempted suicide. The narrator really does not like Marla. He says it categorically. He is really rude to her. He keeps asking her, why are you in my house? What are you doing here? He's really, really nasty to her. Yet he is the one that goes and saves her, right? So the character of Tyler is a really sort of almost misogynistic. He's a bit of an asshole. But the point is that it shouldn't be the narrator going to save Tyler's, friend with benefits. It's the narrator that goes and saves Marla. And why? Because Tyler doesn't care. But if Marla dies, the narrator dies. Right? And there's so many other examples of this. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'll send you guys a link if you're interested. There are so many examples of how this happens in this one particular film, which is why I insist on talking about it over any other film. Because this is a masterful example of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, and all of the unravelings. And all of these tensions that are causing the disruptions within the real, like in the narrative, the filmic object itself, or in the narrative or the filmic object itself. They're things that we can't explain, but when we do, they are things that become real, right? So all of these things exist within the real. We access them through the symbolic, and therefore come into the realm of, the symbolic and understanding society. And it's only through the verbalization thereof that we can understand reality. So I hope that makes sense. If there are any questions, I feel like this is a really long video. If there are any questions, please just let me know. On Wednesday, we will be continuing with Lacan. Yeah, I think we've got 2 left on Lacan. So yes, okay. Thank you, and we'll chat soon.